The deed to the Crawford property felt heavier than it should have, as Owen Walsh stepped off the train in Breckenridge, Colorado, on a bitter October morning in 1882. The sharp mountain air cutting through his wool coat like a knife through butter. He had spent every dollar he had saved from 5 years of cattle driving to buy this ranch site unseen, trusting only a surveyor's report and his own desperate need for a fresh start after the fever took his parents back in Missouri. The town sprawled before him, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the approaching winter, smoke rising from chimneys into the pale sky as miners and ranchers went about their business in the shadow of the 10-mile range. Owen hired a wagon and driver to take him the 8 miles out to his new property, watching the landscape change from the bustle of town to the stark beauty of open range. His ranch sat in a valley where the land rolled gently before rising toward the mountains, with a creek that the surveyor had promised ran year-round cutting through the eastern edge. The main house needed work, but it was solid, built by someone who had known what they were doing before hard times or bad luck had forced them to sell. The barn stood weathered but sturdy, and there were 2 smaller outbuildings he could use for storage or repairs. But it was the neighboring property that caught his attention as the wagon driver pointed it out. The Garrett ranch sprawled across twice as much land as his own, with a main house that looked almost abandoned despite the obvious wealth that had gone into building it. The windows were dark, the yard overgrown in places, and an unsettling quiet hung over the whole property. "Who owns that place?" Owen asked, his gray eyes narrowing against the afternoon sun. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Pete who looked like he had been carved from the mountains themselves, spat tobacco juice over the side before answering. "Marcus Garrett. Keeps to himself mostly. Lost his wife about 3 years back, and he has not been right since. You will not see much of him, I would wager. He comes to town maybe once a month for supplies, talks to no one, and heads straight back out." Owen filed that information away as he paid Pete and watched the wagon rumble back toward town. He spent the rest of the daylight hours exploring his property, noting what needed immediate attention and what could wait until spring. The well water ran clean and cold, which was a blessing. The fences needed mending in places, but nothing he could not handle. By the time darkness fell, he had a fire going in the main house and was heating beans and coffee, feeling the bone-deep satisfaction of being on his own land for the first time in his 24 years. Sleep came hard that first night, his mind too full of plans and possibilities. When he finally drifted off near midnight, it was to dreams of building something lasting, of filling these empty rooms with life and purpose. The scream that woke him around 3 in the morning shattered those dreams like glass. Owen shot upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he kept near his bed. His heart hammered against his ribs as he strained to hear, past the pounding of blood in his ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind rattling the shutters and the settling sounds of an old house adjusting to the cold. Then it came again, faint and desperate, a woman's voice cutting through the night air. It was not quite a scream this time, more like a cry for help that had been nearly smothered, and it was coming from the direction of the Garrett ranch. Owen pulled on his boots and coat, grabbed his rifle and a lantern, and headed out into the freezing darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the frost-covered ground as he made his way toward the neighboring property. Every instinct he had developed during years of night watches on cattle drives told him something was very wrong. That sound had been too raw, too filled with genuine terror to be anything innocent. He approached the Garrett house cautiously, watching for any sign of movement. The place looked even more desolate in the moonlight, its grand facade gone to seed like a once beautiful woman who had stopped caring about her appearance. No lights showed in any of the windows. No smoke rose from the chimneys despite the brutal cold. If Marcus Garrett was home, he was either dead to the world or deliberately ignoring whatever was happening on his property. Owen circled the house slowly, his breath misting in the frigid air. He was about to conclude that he had imagined the whole thing, that the sound had been an owl or a coyote or his own exhaustion playing tricks on him, when he heard it again. This time he could pinpoint the source more clearly. The sound was coming from below ground level, from somewhere beneath the house itself. A cellar. He found the entrance on the north side of the house, a pair of angled wooden doors set into the ground like the entrance to a storm shelter. A heavy chain had been wrapped around the handles and secured with a padlock that gleamed new and silver in the moonlight. Owen set down his lantern and examined the setup more closely, his jaw tightening with each detail he noticed. This was not just a locked cellar. This was a prison. "Hello." He called out, keeping his voice low but clear. "Is someone down there?" The response was immediate, a scrambling sound followed by a woman's voice, hoarse and desperate. "Please, please help me. I have been down here for so long. Please." Owen's mind raced. This was clearly Marcus Garrett's property, and whatever was happening here was technically none of his business. But a woman was being held prisoner in a cellar, and no law of man or God would convince him to walk away from that. "I am going to get you out," he said firmly. "Just hold on." He could have shot the padlock off, but the noise would likely bring Garrett running if the man was anywhere nearby. Instead, Owen went to his own barn and retrieved a set of bolt cutters he had packed among his tools. By the time he returned to the Garrett cellar, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The bolt cutters made short work of the chain, though the metal shrieked in protest as it gave way. Owen yanked the cellar doors open and raised his lantern, peering down into the darkness below. A woman stood at the bottom of a rough wooden staircase, one hand shielding her eyes against the sudden light. She was painfully thin, her dress hanging off her frame like it had been made for someone else. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves past her shoulders, and even from this distance, Owen could see she was trembling. "Come on up," he said gently. "You are safe now." She climbed the stairs slowly, like someone who was not quite sure her legs would support her. When she reached the top and stepped out into the pre-dawn light, Owen got his first clear look at her face. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with fine features that would have been beautiful if not for the gauntness of hunger and the dark circles under her eyes. But it was her eyes themselves that caught him, a striking shade of green that held more fear and determination than he had ever seen in another human being. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you, I thought I was going to die down there." "Who are you?" Owen asked, though he was already shrugging off his coat and draping it around her shoulders. She was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. "What happened?" "My name is Violet Emerson," she said, pulling his coat tight around herself. "Marcus Garrett is my stepfather. He locked me down there after I refused to marry the man he chose for me. That was 6 weeks ago." The words hit Owen like a physical blow. 6 weeks. This woman had been imprisoned in that cellar for 6 weeks, through the increasing cold of autumn in the Colorado mountains, likely with minimal food and water. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said, glancing toward the main house. "Is he in there?" Violet shook her head. "He left 3 days ago. He usually brings me food and water once a week, but he has not come back. I thought maybe he had decided to just let me starve." The casual cruelty of it made Owen's blood boil, but he kept his voice calm. "My ranch is right next door. I have food and a fire. Can you walk?" "I think so." She took a step and swayed. Owen caught her before she could fall, and after a moment's hesitation, he simply picked her up. She weighed almost nothing, and she did not protest, just rested her head against his shoulder as he carried her across the frost-covered ground to his property. Inside his house, Owen settled Violet in the chair closest to the fireplace and built up the fire until heat filled the room. He heated water for tea and made a simple breakfast of eggs and bread, watching as she devoured it with the desperate hunger of someone who had been starving. He had to stop her from eating too quickly, knowing her stomach would rebel after so long with so little. As the morning light strengthened and color began to return to her face, Owen sat down across from her and listened to her story. Violet Emerson had come to Colorado 2 years ago with her mother, who had married Marcus Garrett after a whirlwind courtship in Denver. Garrett had seemed charming at first, a successful rancher with money and position. But after the wedding, his true nature had emerged. He was controlling, cruel, and obsessed with maintaining his social standing in Breckenridge. When Violet's mother had died suddenly last spring, Violet had found herself trapped. She had no family to return to, no money of her own, and nowhere to go. Garrett had informed her that she would marry his business associate, a man twice her age who owned a stake in several mining operations. When Violet had refused, Garrett had locked her in the cellar, telling her she could come out when she changed her mind. "I kept refusing," Violet said, her hands wrapped around the warm cup of tea like it was a lifeline. "Every time he came down, I told him I would never marry that man. I would rather die. And I think he finally decided to let me." Owen felt a cold fury settling in his chest. "He cannot get away with this. We need to go to the sheriff." "And tell him what?" Violet's laugh was bitter. "That my stepfather disciplined his disobedient stepdaughter. Marcus Garrett is one of the wealthiest men in this county. Who do you think the sheriff will believe?" She had a point, and Owen knew it. Justice in the West was often less about law and more about power, and a newcomer with a single ranch would have little weight against an established man like Garrett. "Then we need to make sure he cannot touch you again," Owen said firmly. "You will stay here. I will protect you." Violet looked at him with those striking green eyes, and he saw tears beginning to form. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." "Because it is the right thing to do," Owen said simply, "and because no woman deserves what he did to you." The tears spilled over then, and Owen sat quietly while Violet cried, purging weeks of fear and desperation. When she finally composed herself, she looked at him with something like wonder. "I do not even know your name," she said. "Owen Walsh. I just bought this property yesterday." "Yesterday." Violet looked around the sparsely furnished room, then back at him. "You just got here, and you are already putting yourself at risk for a stranger." "Seems like good timing to me," Owen said, and was rewarded with the faint ghost of a smile on her face. They spent the rest of that day planning. Owen gave Violet his bedroom and took the smaller room for himself. He rode into town and bought supplies, including proper clothing for Violet and enough food to last them through the winter if necessary. He also made careful inquiries about Marcus Garrett and learned that the man was indeed in Denver on business and was not expected back for another week. That gave them time. Violet recovered quickly once she had food, warmth, and safety. Within 3 days, color had returned to her face and strength to her limbs. She insisted on helping around the ranch, and Owen found himself grateful for the company. She was intelligent, with a sharp wit that had survived her ordeal, and she knew ranching from her time with Garrett. Together they mended fences, organized the barn, and prepared the property for winter. Owen found himself watching her when he thought she was not looking, struck by her resilience and grace. She had every reason to be broken, but instead she was fighting to rebuild herself. There was something magnetic about her determination, something that drew him in ways he had not expected. For her part, Violet found herself studying Owen when his attention was elsewhere. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair and those striking gray eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. But it was not his appearance that captivated her. It was his quiet strength, his steady kindness, the way he treated her like a person worthy of respect rather than property to be managed. After 2 years of Marcus Garrett's cruelty, Owen Walsh was like water in the desert. On the 5th day, as they worked together to repair a section of fence line, Violet paused and looked out across the valley. "I keep waiting for this to feel real," she said quietly. "I keep thinking I am going to wake up back in that cellar." Owen set down the post he had been carrying and moved to stand beside her. "You are free, Violet, I promise you that. For now," she said. "But what happens when Marcus comes back? What happens when he realizes I am gone? Then we deal with it together." Owen's voice was firm. "He does not own you. He never did." Violet turned to look at him, and in that moment, something shifted between them. It was as if all the careful distance they had been maintaining suddenly collapsed, and they were left staring at each other with a new awareness crackling in the air. "Owen," Violet said softly, and the way she said his name made his heart hammer in his chest. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and Violet closed her eyes, leaning into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "I do not want to take advantage," Owen said, his voice rough. "You have been through so much, and I do not want you to feel obligated." Violet opened her eyes and looked at him with an intensity that took his breath away. "You saved my life, Owen, but that is not why I am feeling this. I am feeling this because you are good and kind and strong, and because when I am with you, I feel like myself again. I feel human again." Owen cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing away tears he had not realized were falling. "You are the most human person I have ever met," he said. "You are brave and resilient and beautiful, and I have been falling for you since the moment I heard you calling for help." When he kissed her, it was gentle and careful, a question rather than a demand. Violet answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with a desperation that spoke of all the fear and loneliness she had endured. They stood there in the cold afternoon, holding each other like they were the only 2 people in the world, and for that moment, nothing else mattered. They made their way back to the house hand in hand, and spent the evening talking by the fire. Owen told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his parents, about his dreams for this ranch. Violet talked about her childhood in Ohio, about her mother's death, about the future she had imagined before Marcus Garrett had stolen it from her. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said, staring into the flames. "I love children and I love learning. I thought maybe I could start a school somewhere, help kids who did not have access to education." "You still could," Owen said. "There are families scattered all through these mountains. I would wager most of their children have never seen the inside of a schoolhouse." Violet looked at him with hope dawning in her eyes. "Do you really think so?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," Owen said honestly. That night, Violet kissed him goodnight at the door to his bedroom, and Owen lay awake for hours thinking about the future. He had bought this ranch planning to build a life alone, but now he could not imagine it without Violet in it. Marcus Garrett returned on a gray morning 8 days after Owen had found Violet. Owen was in the barn when he heard the horse approaching at a gallop, and he grabbed his rifle and stepped outside to find Garrett dismounting in his yard. The man was in his early 50s, with iron gray hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty in his eyes. He was well dressed in a tailored coat and expensive boots, every inch the successful rancher. But Owen could see the rage simmering beneath the polished exterior. "Where is she?" Garrett demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "Where is my stepdaughter?" "Safe," Owen said calmly, though his finger was near the trigger of his rifle. "And she is not going back with you." Garrett's face darkened. "You have no right to interfere." "She is my responsibility, and I will discipline her as I see fit." "Discipline?" Owen's voice was hard as iron. "You locked a woman in a cellar for 6 weeks and left her to starve. That is not discipline. That is attempted murder." "She is disobedient and willful," Garrett spat. "I was teaching her proper respect. Now hand her over before I have you arrested for kidnapping." "Go ahead," Owen said. "Ride into town and tell the sheriff that I rescued a woman you were holding prisoner. Let us see how that works out for you." Garrett's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but Owen had his rifle up and pointed before the man could draw. "Do not," Owen said quietly. "I have no desire to kill you, but I will if you force my hand." For a long moment they stood frozen, two men separated by a few yards of ground and an unbridgeable moral divide. Finally, Garrett lowered his hand, his face twisting with impotent fury. "This is not over," he said. "You think you can just steal what is mine? I will ruin you. I will make sure you lose this ranch. I will make sure everyone in this county knows you are a thief and a troublemaker." "Do what you want," Owen said, "but you will not touch Violet again. That is not negotiable." Garrett mounted his horse and wheeled it around, but before he rode off, he looked back at Owen with cold calculation. "She will never be free of me. I am still her legal guardian, and she has no money, no prospects. Eventually, she will have to come crawling back." "Not while I am breathing," Owen said, after Garrett left. Owen found Violet standing in the doorway of the house, pale but steady. She had heard everything. "He is right about one thing," she said quietly. "I am still legally under his authority until I am 25 or married. He could petition a judge to force me back." Owen looked at her, his heart pounding. "Then marry me." Violet's eyes went wide. "Owen, you do not have to do that. I am not doing it because I have to." Owen closed the distance between them and took her hands in his. "I am doing it because I want to. I am doing it because I love you, Violet Emerson. I know we have only known each other for a little over a week, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me, not to escape him, but to build a life with me." Tears streamed down Violet's face, but she was smiling. "I love you too. Yes, yes, I will marry you." They rode into Breckenridge that afternoon and found the circuit judge who happened to be in town. With 2 witnesses pulled from the street, they were married in the judge's office. Owen in his work clothes and Violet in a simple dress he had bought her. It was not the wedding either of them might have imagined, but as Owen slipped a plain gold band onto her finger and kissed her as his wife, nothing had ever felt more right. Word spread quickly through the small town, and by evening half of Breckenridge knew that the new rancher had married Marcus Garrett's stepdaughter. The reactions were mixed. Some saw it as romantic, a rescue and a love story. Others whispered that Owen Walsh had made a dangerous enemy and would pay for his interference. Marcus Garrett did not take the news well. He stormed into town the next day, demanding the marriage be annulled, claiming Owen had taken advantage of a woman under his care. But the judge, a stern man named Hendricks who had seen his share of injustice, refused. Violet was of legal age, the marriage had been performed properly, and she had testified freely that she had agreed to it without coercion. "Your authority over Miss Emerson ended the moment she became Mrs. Walsh," Judge Hendricks said firmly. "I suggest you accept that and move on." Garrett left the courthouse in a rage, and Owen knew they had not seen the last of his vengeance. But as he drove the wagon back to the ranch with Violet sitting beside him, her hand in his, he found he did not care. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The first weeks of their marriage were a strange blend of joy and tension. In private, they were discovering each other with the wonder of new lovers, learning what made each other laugh, what old wounds still hurt, what dreams they shared. Owen had never known that love could feel like this, like coming home to a place you had been searching for your whole life. But outside their small sanctuary, Marcus Garrett was making good on his threats. He spread rumors through town about Owen, claiming he was a drifter and a troublemaker. He tried to convince other ranchers not to do business with the Walsh ranch. He even attempted to buy Owen's property out from under him, offering the bank a premium if they would foreclose on any loans. It would have worked, too, except Owen had bought his ranch outright with cash. There were no loans to foreclose on, no mortgage to call in. And the rumors, while damaging, could not undo the fact that Owen was proving himself through hard work and integrity. He helped his neighbors, paid his debts, and treated everyone he met with respect. Slowly, the people of Breckenridge began to see him for who he was rather than who Garrett claimed him to be. Winter came to the mountains with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled waist-high and temperatures that turned breath to ice. Owen and Violet spent the long, dark evenings by the fire, talking and planning and dreaming. She told him about her idea for a school, and he encouraged her to pursue it. He talked about expanding the ranch, maybe bringing in cattle in the spring, and she offered suggestions drawn from her experience with Garrett's operation. But mostly, they were just learning to be married. Owen had never lived with a woman before, never had to navigate the small compromises and adjustments that sharing a life required. Violet had to learn to trust again, to believe that Owen meant what he said, that he would not suddenly turn cruel or controlling. There were difficult moments, times when one of them retreated or misunderstood, but they always came back together, always chose to work through it rather than let it fester. The first time Violet woke from a nightmare about the cellar, Owen held her and talked her through it until the fear subsided. The first time Owen snapped at her because he was exhausted from fighting frozen pipes, Violet simply walked away and came back an hour later with coffee and an honest conversation about stress. They were building something real, foundation stone by foundation stone, and it was hard work, but it was good work. In late December, a massive blizzard trapped them in the house for 4 days. They ran low on firewood and had to burn some of the furniture from the spare room. They ate mostly beans and hardtack because the storm had come on too quickly to properly stock up. But they were warm and safe and together, and somehow those 4 days became some of the happiest of Owen's life. They played cards and told stories and made love while the wind howled outside, and Owen thought that this, right here, was what he had bought that ranch to find. When the storm finally broke and they could dig their way out, they found that one of the barn walls had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. It took Owen 3 days of brutal work in the freezing cold to shore it up and make temporary repairs. Violet worked beside him, hauling lumber and holding boards, her hands red and raw despite the gloves she wore. When they finally finished and stumbled back to the house exhausted, Owen pulled her close and kissed her snow-cold face. "I do not deserve you," he said. "Yes, you do," Violet replied firmly. "And I deserve you. We deserve this life we are building." Christmas came quiet and simple. Owen carved Violet a small wooden box for her treasures, working on it secretly in the barn for weeks. Violet used some of her limited sewing skills to make him a new shirt, soft flannel in blue that brought out his eyes. They cooked a chicken for dinner and opened a bottle of wine Owen had been saving. And as they sat by the fire that night, Violet told him about the Christmases of her childhood. "My father used to read us stories," she said softly. "Before he died when I was 10, he had this big leather book of fairy tales and he would read one every Christmas Eve. I always loved the ones where the brave knight rescued the princess." Owen smiled. "I am not sure I qualify as a knight." "You rescued me from a tower," Violet pointed out. "Or a cellar, which is close enough. That makes you my knight whether you like it or not." "Then I am the luckiest knight who ever lived," Owen said, "because my princess is brave enough that she does not need rescuing. She just needed someone to open the door." Violet kissed him then, slow and sweet, and they went to bed wrapped in each other and the peace of knowing they had found something worth keeping. The new year brought new challenges. In late January, Owen's best horse developed colic and died despite his best efforts to save her. It was a significant loss, both financially and practically, and Owen spent a week in a black mood, angry at himself for not seeing the signs sooner. Violet gave him space when he needed it and drew him out when the anger started to turn inward, and eventually he worked through it. "Life is not going to be easy," Violet said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "We are going to lose things. We are going to fail sometimes, but we have each other and that means we can survive anything else." "When did you get so wise?" Owen asked, pulling her close. "About the time a stubborn cowboy decided I was worth saving," Violet said. February brought a thaw and with it, unwelcome news. Marcus Garrett had filed a lawsuit against Owen, claiming that Violet had stolen property from him before she left, including jewelry and money. It was complete fabrication, but it was also a legal problem that could not be ignored. They rode into town to meet with a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Mills who had her practice above the general store. She listened to their story without interruption, then sat back and studied them both. "He is using the law to harass you," she said bluntly. "The claims are baseless, but defending against them will cost you time and money. That is the point. He is trying to bleed you dry." "What can we do?" Owen asked. Catherine smiled thinly. "We fight back. I will defend you against his claims, and I will file a countersuit on Violet's behalf for false imprisonment and emotional distress. We make this expensive and public for him, too. Men like Marcus Garrett count on people being too afraid or too poor to fight back. Let us show him what happens when someone does." The legal battle that followed consumed much of the spring. Owen and Violet had to make multiple trips to town to meet with Catherine, to give depositions, to appear before judges. Garrett brought in high-priced lawyers from Denver, but Catherine was relentless, methodically dismantling every claim he made. She brought in witnesses who testified to Violet's character. She got a doctor to examine Violet and document the physical effects of her imprisonment. She made Garrett's cruelty a matter of public record. The turning point came when Catherine tracked down the business associate Garrett had wanted Violet to marry. Under oath, the man admitted that Garrett had promised him Violet in exchange for a favorable mining deal. He also admitted that he had known Violet was unwilling and had been troubled by Garrett's methods, though not troubled enough to actually intervene. With that testimony on record, Garrett's position became untenable. His reputation in the community began to crumble as people realized the depth of his cruelty. Other stories started to emerge, whispers about how he had mistreated his late wife, about shady business deals, about intimidation and threats. The veneer of respectability he had maintained for years peeled away, revealing the ugliness beneath. In April, Garrett dropped his lawsuit and agreed to pay Owen and Violet's legal fees. He also signed a document acknowledging that Violet owed him nothing and relinquishing any claim to guardianship. It was not quite the dramatic defeat Owen might have wished for, but it was victory enough. Violet was truly free. "How does it feel?" Owen asked her that night as they celebrated with Catherine over dinner at the hotel in town. Violet was quiet for a moment, her green eyes distant. "It feels like I can finally breathe all the way," she said at last. "Like there was a weight I did not even realize I was carrying, and now it is gone." "What will you do with all that freed-up space?" Catherine asked with a smile. "Start a school," Violet said, and there was steel in her voice. "I am going to teach every child in this valley to read and write and think for themselves, so that no one can ever trap them the way I was trapped." Owen reached over and took her hand, pride swelling in his chest. This woman, his wife, had survived horrors that would have broken most people, and here she was planning to make sure others did not suffer the same fate. Spring turned to summer, and Owen's ranch began to truly take shape. He bought cattle from a rancher north of town and spent long days working them with the help of 2 hired hands, young men from Breckenridge who needed the work. Violet began organizing her school, talking to families scattered through the valley, finding a location, scraping together supplies. The old church building on the edge of town had been abandoned when the congregation built a larger one, and the town council agreed to let Violet use it for her school. She spent weeks cleaning it out, repairing broken windows, whitewashing the walls. Owen helped when he could, and other townspeople began to chip in as well, donating old desks, bringing books, offering support. In August, Violet opened her school with 12 students ranging from 6 to 15 years old. Owen rode out with her that first morning and watched as she greeted each child with warmth and enthusiasm. She was radiant, alive in a way he had never seen, and he fell in love with her all over again watching her in her element. The school was an immediate success. Violet was a natural teacher, patient and creative and demanding in equal measure. She pushed her students to think critically, to question, to imagine. She brought in guest speakers from town to talk about their trades. She organized debates and spelling competitions. She made learning feel like an adventure rather than a chore. And every evening, she came home to Owen with stories about her students, about breakthroughs and funny moments and small victories. They would sit on the porch in the warm summer evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and talk about their days. Owen would tell her about the new calf that had been born or the fence section they had finally finished. And Violet would describe how one of her students had finally grasped long division or another, had written a story that made the whole class laugh. It was domestic and ordinary and absolutely perfect. In September, Violet realized she was pregnant. She told Owen one evening after dinner, her voice nervous but excited. For a moment, he just stared at her, the words not quite processing. Then joy exploded through him, so intense it almost hurt, and he swept her up and spun her around, making her laugh and protest in equal measure. "We are going to have a baby," he said, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. "We are going to have a baby," Violet confirmed, and there were tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears, the best kind. The pregnancy was not easy. Violet was sick every morning for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down. Owen hovered and worried, doing everything he could to make her comfortable. She continued teaching through it all, refusing to give up her school even as her body changed and grew. By winter, she was obviously pregnant and the community rallied around them. Women brought meals and advice. The families with children in Violet's school took turns helping with chores around the ranch. Even Catherine Mills, the lawyer, stopped by with a box of baby clothes, her own children had outgrown. Marcus Garrett left Colorado entirely that fall, selling his ranch to a family from Kansas and disappearing back east. Owen felt nothing but relief at his departure. The man had cast a long shadow over their first year of marriage, and it felt good to finally be free of even the possibility of his interference. Winter was gentler that year, with less snow and milder temperatures. Violet had to close the school in January as her pregnancy advanced, but she spent the time at home planning lessons for when she could reopen and knitting impossibly tiny clothes for the baby that was coming. Owen was terrified. He tried not to show it, tried to be strong and confident for Violet's sake, but the truth was he had never been around babies much. He had no idea how to be a father. What if he was terrible at it? What if he let Violet down? "You are not going to be terrible at it," Violet said when he finally admitted his fears. She was sitting in the rocking chair Owen had built for her, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "You are going to be wonderful, because you are kind and patient and good. And because we are going to figure it out together, just like we have figured out everything else." "What if something goes wrong?" Owen asked quietly. "Childbirth is dangerous, Violet. I could not stand it if I lost you." Violet reached out and took his hand, placing it on her belly where he could feel the baby moving. "I am strong," she said firmly. "I survived Marcus Garrett. I survived that cellar. I am going to survive this too, and then we are going to raise this child together and be ridiculously happy." Owen wanted to believe her, but the fear lingered, a cold knot in his chest that would not quite dissolve. The baby came in early March, during a spring storm that dumped 6 inches of wet snow on the valley overnight. Owen had ridden to town 2 days earlier to bring back the midwife, a capable woman named Sarah who had delivered half the babies in the county. She was staying in the spare room, waiting for the first signs of labor, and she was the one who woke Owen in the pre-dawn darkness to tell him it was time. The next 18 hours were the longest of Owen's life. He tried to help, but mostly he just stayed out of Sarah's way and held Violet's hand when she needed him. She was incredibly strong, bearing the pain with a determination that amazed him, but he could see the exhaustion growing in her eyes as the hours dragged on. "You can do this," he kept telling her. "You are the strongest person I know. You can do this." "I love you," Violet gasped between contractions. "Whatever happens, I need you to know I love you." "Nothing is going to happen," Owen said fiercely. "You are going to be fine. Both of you are going to be fine." He was not sure which of them he was trying to convince. Finally, as the sun was setting and the storm was clearing, Sarah told Violet to push. Owen held her hand so tightly he was probably hurting her, but she did not complain. She just gathered every ounce of strength she had left and pushed their child into the world. The baby's cry was the most beautiful sound Owen had ever heard. "It is a boy," Sarah announced, laying the squalling infant on Violet's chest. "A healthy, perfect boy." Owen looked at his son, red-faced and tiny and absolutely miraculous, and felt something break open in his chest. This was his child, his and Violet's. A new life they had created together, a piece of both of them mixed into something entirely new. "He is perfect," Violet whispered, exhausted but radiant. "Look what we made, Owen, look at him." "He is perfect because he is yours," Owen said, leaning down to kiss her sweaty forehead. "You are amazing. You are so amazing." They named him Thomas after Violet's father, with the middle name James for Owen's own father. Thomas James Walsh, born on March 7, 1884, weighing 7 pounds and already ruling his parents' hearts with an iron fist. The first weeks with a newborn were harder than Owen could have imagined. Thomas cried constantly, especially at night. Violet was healing from the birth and struggling with exhaustion. Owen was trying to keep up with the ranch work while also helping with the baby, and he felt like he was failing at everything. But slowly, they found their rhythm. Thomas began to settle into a more predictable schedule. Violet regained her strength. Owen learned how to change diapers and calm a crying baby and function on 4 hours of sleep, and there were moments of pure joy that made all the struggle worthwhile. The first time Thomas smiled, a real smile, not just gas, Violet cried and Owen felt his heart expand. The first time he wrapped his tiny hand around Owen's finger and held on tight, Owen understood what people meant when they talked about a love so fierce it hurt. Violet reopened her school in May, bringing Thomas with her in a basket. The students were delighted, taking turns holding the baby and reading to him. Violet taught with Thomas strapped to her chest or napping in a corner of the classroom, and somehow she made it all look effortless. Summer came warm and golden, and Owen's ranch thrived. The cattle were healthy and multiplying. The crops he had planted for winter feed were growing strong. He hired another hand, a man named Jake, who had lost his own ranch in a fire and was grateful for the steady work. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch with Thomas sleeping in Violet's arms, Owen looked at his wife and felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening. "What are you thinking?" Violet asked, catching his gaze. "I am thinking about how different my life is from what I imagined a year ago," Owen said. "I thought I was coming here to build a ranch. I did not know I was coming here to find you, to find this." Violet smiled, the sunset turning her hair to copper fire. "I used to think my life was over. When I was in that cellar, I genuinely believed I would die there. And even after you saved me, I thought I was just surviving, just getting by. I did not know I could feel like this, happy, truly happy." "We have come a long way," Owen agreed. "We have," Violet said. "And we have so much further to go. There are going to be hard times ahead. More winters, more losses, more fights. But we will get through them together, just like we got through everything else." "Together," Owen echoed and reached over to take her free hand. The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings, just as Violet had predicted. There were harsh winters and dry summers, cattle that died of disease and crops that failed, arguments and disappointments, and the grinding stress of making a living from unforgiving land. But there were also triumphs. Owen's ranch grew and prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the valley. Violet's school expanded, eventually requiring an assistant teacher to handle all the students who wanted to attend. Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler to a bright, curious child who loved books and horses in equal measure. When Thomas was 3, Violet gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, after the lawyer who had helped them. 2 years after that came another son, Samuel, who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. The house had to be expanded to accommodate their growing family, and Owen spent 2 summers building additional rooms and a larger kitchen. Violet planted a garden that became the envy of the county, growing vegetables and herbs and flowers that filled their home with color and life. They became pillars of the Breckenridge community. Owen served on the town council and helped settle disputes between ranchers. Violet's school became so well regarded that families moved to the area specifically so their children could attend. They hosted gatherings at their ranch, barn dances and summer picnics where the whole valley would come together. There were losses, too. Owen's oldest hired hand, the one who had been with him almost from the beginning, died in a riding accident. Violet lost a pregnancy between Catherine and Samuel, a devastating blow that took months to heal from. There were droughts and blizzards, mountain lions that attacked the cattle, and the constant grinding work that ranching required. But through it all, they had each other. On the hard days, they leaned on each other. On the good days, they celebrated together. They fought sometimes, because they were both stubborn and strong-willed, but they always came back to the love that had brought them together in the first place. One evening when Thomas was 8, Catherine was 5, and Samuel was 3, the family sat down to dinner in their expanded dining room. The table was laden with food from their garden and their ranch, cooked by Violet with help from Catherine, who was just learning. The windows were open to let in the summer breeze, and the sound of laughter and talking filled the room. Owen looked around the table at his family, at Violet, who caught his eye and smiled, at Thomas, who was explaining something about horses to Catherine, while Samuel tried to steal food from his brother's plate. He thought about the lonely man who had stepped off the train in Breckenridge 7 years ago, desperate for a fresh start but not really believing he would find one. He had bought a ranch, yes, but he had found so much more. He had found purpose and community. He had found love and family. He had found a life worth living, full of meaning and connection and joy. And it had all started with a cry in the darkness, with a woman locked in a cellar who had refused to give up hope. After dinner, after the children were in bed, Owen and Violet walked out to the porch as they did almost every evening. They sat in the rocking chairs Owen had made, close enough that their hands could touch, and watched the stars come out over the mountains. "You ever regret it?" Violet asked quietly. "Buying the ranch next to Marcus Garrett, getting tangled up in my mess." Owen turned to look at her, this woman who had been through hell and come out stronger, who had built a life of purpose from the ashes of cruelty, who had given him everything that mattered. "Not for a single second," he said. "You were never a mess, Violet. You were a gift, the best gift I ever received." "Even when I am stubborn," Violet teased, but there was real vulnerability in her eyes. "Especially when you are stubborn," Owen said, leaning over to kiss her. "That is when I know you are fighting for something that matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just being together. Then Violet said, "I want to expand the school, build a real building with multiple classrooms, bring in more teachers. Create something that will last long after we are gone." "Then we will do it," Owen said simply. "Whatever you need. It will be expensive. It will take years." "Good things usually do," Owen replied. "We have time. We have each other. We have everything we need." Violet leaned her head on his shoulder and they watched the night deepen around them. Somewhere in the house behind them, one of their children stirred and called out in sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new worries. But tonight, they had this moment of peace. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and milestones. Thomas grew into a young man who loved ranching as much as his father did, working alongside Owen from the time he was big enough to sit a horse. Catherine developed her mother's passion for teaching and began helping at the school as soon as she was old enough. Samuel was the wild one, always exploring, always finding trouble, but with a good heart that reminded Owen of Violet. True to her word, Violet built her expanded school. It took 5 years of fundraising and planning and construction. But in 1892, the Owen Walsh Academy opened its doors. It was named in honor of Violet's mother, whose name had been Emma Emerson before she married Marcus Garrett, and it represented everything Violet had dreamed of. Multiple classrooms, a real library, science equipment, and teachers who shared Violet's vision of education as liberation. Owen stood with her at the opening ceremony, now in his mid-30s with gray beginning to thread through his hair, and felt the same pride he had felt watching her teach her first class years before. She had taken her suffering and turned it into something beautiful, something that would help generations of children. "My mother would have loved this," Violet said quietly as they watched students flood into the new building. She always believed education could change lives. "So do you," Owen said, "and you are proving it every day." When Owen turned 45, the children grown and starting lives of their own, he took stock of his life with wonder. Thomas was running the ranch now, having taken over more and more responsibility as Owen slowed down. He had married a sweet girl from town named Alice, and they were expecting Owen and Violet's first grandchild. Catherine was teaching at her mother's school and courting a young lawyer who had recently moved to Breckenridge. Samuel had joined the army despite his parents' worry, serving out in Arizona Territory, but writing long letters home every week. The ranch had grown to encompass land on both sides of their original property, including the old Garrett place, which they had bought after Marcus died back east. Owen had torn down the main house there, unable to stand the thought of what had happened to Violet in that cellar. But he had kept the land and used it to expand his herd. He and Violet were more in love than ever, their bond deepened by decades of shared experiences and mutual support. They still sat on the porch most evenings, still talked and laughed and planned. They had arguments and disagreements because they were both too strong-willed to simply agree on everything, but they had learned how to fight fair and how to forgive. "You remember that first morning?" Violet asked one evening as they watched yet another sunset paint the mountains. "When you carried me to your house and made me breakfast. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met," Owen said. "And I remember falling in love with you before I even knew what was happening." "I was so scared," Violet admitted, "not just of Marcus but of everything, of trusting someone new, of hoping again." "But you did it anyway," Owen said. "That is what courage is, I think, being scared and doing it anyway." Violet smiled and took his hand. "We have had a good life, Owen Walsh." "The best life," Owen agreed. "And we are not done yet." Their first grandchild, a boy named Owen Thomas Walsh after both his father and grandfather, was born in the spring of 1897. Owen held the tiny infant and felt the same overwhelming love he had felt holding his own children, that sense of connection to the future, of legacy and hope. Violet became a doting grandmother, making time in her busy schedule at the school to visit and spoil her grandson. She taught him his letters before he was 3 and was already planning his educational trajectory. Much to Thomas and Alice's amusement, more grandchildren followed. Catherine married her lawyer and had twin girls. Samuel came home from the army and took over running the southern section of the ranch, eventually marrying and starting a family of his own. The house that had once felt too big for just Owen was now bursting with life whenever the family gathered, which was often. Holidays became sprawling affairs with multiple generations, with children running through the rooms and the sound of laughter echoing off the walls. As Owen entered his 50s, he began to slow down more noticeably. His back ached from decades of hard physical labor. His hands were gnarled from countless hours of rope work and fence mending, but he was content in a way that went bone deep. He had built something that would last, a legacy not just of land and cattle but of family and love. Violet remained vibrant and energetic, throwing herself into her school work with the same passion she had always had. But she made time for Owen, for long walks through their property, for quiet mornings drinking coffee on the porch, for nights wrapped in each other's arms. "I love you," she would tell him, and it still made his heart skip just like it had the first time. "I love you more," he would respond, and they would laugh at the familiar exchange, at the comfort of words they had been saying to each other for decades. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that seemed to include half the county. There were speeches and toasts, stories about Owen and Violet that made everyone laugh and cry. Thomas talked about his father's integrity and work ethic. Catherine spoke about her mother's fierce dedication to education and justice. Samuel simply raised his glass and said, "To the best parents anyone could ask for, who taught us that love is an action, not just a feeling." Owen held Violet close as they danced that night, surrounded by the life they had built together. "Do you remember when I proposed?" he asked. "You mean when you offered to marry me so Marcus could not get to me?" Violet said, her eyes twinkling. "No, I mean when I told you I loved you and wanted to build a life with you," Owen corrected. "I remember," Violet said softly. "I remember thinking that I did not deserve that kind of happiness, that someone like me, broken and damaged, could not possibly have a fairy tale ending." "You were never broken," Owen said firmly. "You were wounded, but you were never broken, and this is not a fairy tale ending. It is just our life, our messy, complicated, beautiful life." Violet kissed him then, in front of all their children and grandchildren and friends, and Owen thought about the man he had been when he stepped off that train in Breckenridge. He had been so alone, so uncertain of the future. He had bought a ranch hoping to build something lasting, but not really believing he could. And then he had heard a cry in the darkness, and everything had changed. As they entered their 60s, Owen and Violet gradually handed over more and more responsibility to their children. Thomas ran the ranch with skill and dedication, making improvements and changes that Owen fully supported. Catherine became the principal of the Emerson Walsh Academy when Violet finally retired, carrying on her mother's legacy with her own unique vision. Samuel expanded the ranch's southern operations and began breeding horses in addition to cattle. Owen and Violet had time now for the things they had always meant to do, but never quite gotten around to. They took a trip to Denver, staying in a fancy hotel and seeing the city that had grown so much since they were young. They spent weeks at a time visiting Samuel's spread in the southern part of the property, helping with the horses and spoiling their youngest son's children. But mostly, they were just together. They worked in Violet's garden, preserving vegetables for winter. They read books aloud to each other in the evenings. They attended church on Sundays and community events when the weather was good. They watched their grandchildren grow and thrive, secure in the knowledge that they had created something that would continue long after they were gone. One evening in late summer, when Owen was 67 and Violet was 65, they sat on their porch as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. Owen's hair was fully gray now, his face lined with age and weather. Violet's dark hair had silver threads running through it, and her hands bore the marks of decades of work. But to Owen, she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her climbing out of that cellar. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if I had not heard you that night?" Owen asked. Violet was quiet for a moment, considering. "I try not to," she said finally, "because I genuinely believe I would have died down there. Marcus had given up on me. He was just waiting for me to starve or freeze or give up. If you had not heard me, if you had not been brave enough to help a stranger, I would be gone." Owen reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I am so glad I was there." "So am I," Violet said. "You gave me my life back, Owen, but more than that, you gave me a life worth living. You gave me love and family and purpose. You gave me everything." "You gave me just as much," Owen said. "Maybe more. I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You taught me what it means to really live." They sat in silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars they had watched together for more than 30 years. The house behind them was quiet, their children grown and in homes of their own, their grandchildren tucked into beds scattered across the valley. "I would do it all again," Violet said softly. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every loss, I would do it all again to end up here with you." "So would I," Owen said. 1,000 times over. They remained on that porch until the night grew cold, reluctant to leave the peace of the moment. When they finally went inside, Owen banked the fire while Violet changed for bed. They lay down together in the bed they had shared for 3 decades, wrapped in each other's arms the way they had been countless times before. "I love you, Owen Walsh," Violet whispered in the darkness. "I love you, Violet Walsh," Owen replied. And in that small house on a ranch in the Colorado mountains, surrounded by the life they had built together, they fell asleep content and secure in the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious. The years continued their inevitable march. Owen's health began to decline in his early 70s, his heart weakening from a lifetime of hard work and mountain winters. He spent more time resting, less time working, but he never complained. Violet cared for him with the same fierce devotion she had shown for everything else in her life, making sure he was comfortable, making sure he knew he was loved. On a clear spring morning in 1915, when Owen was 77 years old, he sat on the porch with Violet and watched the sun rise over the mountains. Thomas and his family lived in the main house now, having taken it over when Owen's health made the stairs too difficult. Owen and Violet had moved into the smaller house on the property, the one Owen had originally built as a guest house, but which now served as their final home. "It is a good life we have had," Owen said, his voice weaker than it once was but still steady. "The best," Violet agreed. She was 75 now, still sharp and engaged but feeling her own age in aching joints and failing eyesight. "I have no regrets," Owen continued. "Not a single one. Everything I wanted, everything I hoped for, I found with you." Violet felt tears prickling her eyes, understanding what he was saying, what he was preparing her for. "We still have time," she said, even though she knew it was not entirely true. "We have had time," Owen corrected gently. "So much beautiful time, and I am grateful for every moment of it." He reached for her hand, and she took it, holding on tight like she could anchor him to this world through sheer force of will. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, warming the valley, bringing light to the land they had loved and worked and raised their family on. "Tell me again," Owen said. "Tell me the story." Violet smiled through her tears, knowing exactly what he meant. "Once upon a time," she began, "a cowboy bought a ranch in Colorado, and on his very first night he heard someone calling for help." "He was brave," Owen interjected, his eyes closed but a smile on his face. "He was brave," Violet agreed. "He went out into the darkness and he found a woman who had given up hope, and he saved her." "She saved him right back," Owen said. "She did," Violet said, "and they built a life together. A beautiful, messy, perfect life filled with love and family and purpose. They faced hardships and overcame them. They lost things and found new things. They grew old together, watching their children and grandchildren thrive. And they lived happily ever after," Owen finished. "They lived happily ever after," Violet echoed. Owen passed quietly that afternoon, surrounded by his family, holding Violet's hand until the very end. The funeral brought people from all over the county, testament to the life he had lived and the impact he had made. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot he had picked out years before, where he could watch over the land and family he had loved. Violet lived for 3 more years, dividing her time between her children and grandchildren, watching new great-grandchildren being born, seeing the ranch continue to thrive. She remained sharp and engaged, still advocating for education, still fighting for justice, still teaching anyone who would listen. But everyone who knew her could see that part of her was missing. She was not complete without Owen, not whole without the man who had been her partner and love for more than 3 decades. On a warm summer evening in 1918, Violet sat on the porch of the small house where she had spent her final years with Owen. Her grandson, young Owen Thomas, who was now a man of 21, sat with her, keeping her company as the sun set. "Tell me about grandfather," he asked, as he had many times before. Violet smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "He was the best man I ever knew," she said. "Brave and kind and good. He saved my life, you know. Not just from your great-great-grandfather Marcus, but from despair, from giving up. He showed me that love was real, that happy endings were possible." "You saved him too, grandmother," young Owen said. "That is what father always says, that you saved each other." "I suppose we did," Violet agreed. "That is what love is, I think. Saving each other over and over again every day in small ways and large ones." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars that Violet had watched with Owen so many times. She felt tired, bone-deep tired, but also at peace. She had lived a full life, a rich life, a life filled with love and purpose and meaning. "I will see him again soon," Violet said softly, more to herself than to her grandson. Young Owen took her hand, understanding. "He will be waiting for you." "I know," Violet said and smiled. "He always waited for me." That night, Violet Walsh died peacefully in her sleep, her long life finally coming to its natural end. She was buried next to Owen on the hill overlooking the ranch, and their children made sure the headstones reflected who they had been and what they had meant to each other. Owen Walsh, 1838–1915. Beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He lived with courage and died with love. Violet Emerson Walsh, 1843–1918. Beloved wife, mother, and educator. She survived with grace and thrived with passion. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through Thomas's line and then to his children and their children after them. The Emerson Walsh Academy still stands in Breckenridge, educating children just as Violet had envisioned. Her legacy of empowerment and learning living on long after her death. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets over the Colorado mountains in gold and pink, people swear they can see two figures sitting on the porch of the old Walsh Ranch. A tall man with gray eyes and a woman with dark hair, sitting close together, hands intertwined, watching over the land and family they built together from courage and love and hope. It is just a story, of course. A legend that grew up around two people who had lived extraordinary lives in what seemed like ordinary ways. But for those who knew them, for those who remember, it feels true in the way that the best stories always do. Because Owen and Violet Walsh did not just build a ranch or start a school. They built a life together that became the foundation for countless other lives. They proved that love could overcome cruelty, that courage could defeat despair, that two broken people could heal each other and create something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. They proved that happy endings were not just possible, but worth fighting for. And in doing so, they became the kind of story that gets passed down through generations, the kind of love that inspires others to believe in the possibility of their own happy endings. In the end, that might be the greatest legacy of all. Not the land or the school or even the children and grandchildren who carried their names and values forward. But the simple, profound truth that love matters, that courage matters, that choosing to help a stranger crying in the darkness can change everything. Owen Walsh bought a ranch next door to Marcus Garrett in the autumn of 1882. He found a woman locked in a cellar and he saved her. And in saving her, he saved himself. Together they built a life that mattered, a love that endured, and a legacy that will last as long as people tell stories about the West. And that is not just a happy ending. That is a life well lived.